Hello and welcome to the Smarter Conversations podcast, where we'll be weaving together voices from the cotton supply chain. This podcast is brought to you by the US Cotton Trust Protocol. I'm your host, Kathy Smith. I'm an independent freelance journalist. This podcast series does exactly what the name implies. I'm going to be talking to some of the key movers and shakers in the global textile supply chain to dig into the world of cotton. Well, this is the 11th episode in our series, and we're focusing on the relationship between cotton and greenhouse gases. How can cotton production bring down greenhouse gas emissions, and how does it play a role in absorbing carbon from the atmosphere? Well, joining me to discuss this today, Deepika Mishra. Deepika, welcome to you. I know you have an MSc in horticultural science, you have a PhD in plant and soil science, and you are a special advisor to the US Cotton Trust Protocol. And also joining us is John Lindamood, a Trust Protocol cotton grower from Tennessee, in fact, Tiptonville in Tennessee. So, John, put us on the map. Where are you exactly?
We're in the northwest corner of Tennessee, right on the banks of the Mississippi River, about 100 miles north of Memphis.
Sounds great. And Deepika, you are where?
I'm actually in the beautiful Pacific Northwest area in Seattle, Washington.
So now that's interesting because Seattle has had incredibly high temperatures recently, I think. And I mean, if we're talking about greenhouse gases and climate change, you've really felt it, I think, in recent days.
That's right there. In fact, in Seattle, 1/3 of the houses, they only have air conditioning because prior to this, nobody needed it. And on last Monday, the temperature was at 112 Fahrenheit. So that showed us how much greenhouse gas emissions is important that we are talking today.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, specifically, Deepika, for the cotton production industry, I mean, why is it so important that cotton growers should take this very seriously?
Especially, with cotton, we use so many farm equipments, and agriculture itself, it contributes 7% to the greenhouse gas emissions. And when we are just talking about cotton, it's also part of that agriculture. And since we are using all this energy and that is directly contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, that's why it is important.
So what's the balance looking like at the moment then, Deepika, in terms of the emissions that are being produced by cotton producers and also their ability to actually mitigate the effects?
Actually, it's looking pretty good. And I mean, cotton producers, all they have done is continued improvements to shrink the carbon footprint. And it's been happening since past 35 years. And you can see the numbers, you can see it in published sources. And even currently, it's the same thing that's what's happening. The trend is looking really positive.
But in general terms, though, the emissions themselves, they're coming from the operations.
Correct.
And what else? Fertilizers, pesticides?
Correct. So basically the greenhouse gas emissions, it's coming from two sources. First is energy. It comes from both direct and indirect. When I say direct, it's coming from all the farm equipment, pumping irrigation water, crop drying, and accounting for the fuel type, whether it's a diesel, electricity, or gas. And when I'm talking about indirect energy, this is coming from the fertilizer production and all the crop health protectant production or all the products that we use in the farm. Second is your nitrous oxide emission from soil. This is pretty much which is released from the soil microbial activity in association with the fertilizer nitrogen application. So, but to reduce this nitrous oxide emission, a grower can adopt various practices like using the right source of nitrogen, finding what is the appropriate method of application.
Well, I mean, and that's something that we will talk to John about, I think, in a minute. But let me just ask you briefly, though, Deepika, on the plus side, the cotton crop actually is pretty good at storing carbon in the soil.
Correct. It has a unique root structure that helps in storing and sequestering the carbon. And that itself is a very key thing towards the soil health, which is directly relating to the emissions.
Great. Well, John, let me bring you in and take us out into the fields, if you would, and let us know how conscious you are of this whole need to reduce greenhouse gases, and how does it affect the way that you grow your crops?
Well, let me start by saying that we're in a business of producing food and fiber, not only for our country but for the world, and we're in the business of doing that as economically as possible. Now, happily, managing our inputs also has the benefit of being environmentally reducing our environmental footprint. We want to allocate the scarce resources and limit our use of those. Deepika talked about fertilizer, water usage, energy usage. All that has a cost associated with it, and we're every day looking how can we reduce our use of these limited resources. Over the last 30 years, we've been involved in no-till, which is a practice of leaving residue on the soil from the previous crop and planting into it the following year. She was mentioning carbon emissions from the soil. This limits that. Additionally, in the last 10 years, we've become heavily involved in cover crops, where we not only have the residue from the previous crop, we're actually planting crops that'll get knee-high or waist-high, and we plant into those. We terminate those and plant into them. That limits the movement of soil due to erosion. Nitrates and phosphates leaving leaving the site where we're utilizing them, it keeps everything in place.
Now, I'm just going to say, so as you were saying, I mean, it's in your interest to reduce costs, and you really are doing an incredible amount, it sounds like.
Well, we are now. We have been for the last. I've been farming for 40 years now, and we started no-till farming in the early 80s. We're 90% no-till. Any given year, we don't work more than 10% of our acreage. And that's a big thing, but it reduces the utilization of equipment, reduces fuel costs, the fuel emissions. It also reduces our use of pesticides. Cover crops shade the ground and inhibit the germination of noxious weeds. It increases water filtration. Aside from these physical practices of cover crops and no-till, we're in the last 20 years, it's become an exciting time to be involved in farming because of the technological advances. We use remote imaging to establish management zones in our fields, where we go in and we sample the soil and plant tissue analysis so that we can better apply fertilizers in site-specific manner. With the use of GPS, we can put more fertilizer where it will be utilized to increase productivity, but just as importantly, we're able to cut back the use of fertilizer and herbicides where we don't need them, where they're not called for. And we've realized some tremendous savings in that respect.
So an enormous amount going on, Deepika. So that's what John's doing on his farm, and obviously for many years has been really developing this area. If you look at the carbon footprint of cotton and greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, there has been a lot of progress made in recent years, hasn't there? But are the trends still going in the right direction? What's the sort of bigger picture?
Yeah, I mean, like John said, like it's for the past 30 years, we have been helping in reduction of greenhouse gas emission. In fact, the latest data that we have from Field to Market, which was published in 2016, there has been 31% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 1980. So that's a big number when we are talking about 31%. And with what we are doing today with what our innovative and progressive growers are doing today with the right cultivation and practices, that is the way to go.
And when you say the innovative growers, though, I mean, is everybody on board? I mean, what percentage of cotton growers are as innovative as John is?
Well, it's kind of like, I always say, growers especially, they kind of look out to their neighbors. John, you might know this better, but if one person does it, another person does it. So usually that is an influence. And similarly in cotton growing regions, we do see that trend. I mean, I don't have a number in percentage, but I can say definitely there are growers that are trying different things. So one of the example I came across actually um, last week is a grower from Texas, and he's a cotton grower. And what he did, and that's a very good story that fascinated me, and it sounds wild. He had the idea to plant a perennial summer dormant grass that serves as a permanent cover crop for the dryland cotton. So optimally, the way it happens, the grass goes dormant in the warm spring, allowing the soil moisture to build for planting the cotton. And then in the fall, when the temperatures cools down, this grass greens up and provides multiple benefits from wind protection, especially in Texas, and then strengthening the soil for harvesting during wet falls, continuous ground cover, and that itself gives us for a lot of room for sequestering carbon.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Using nature to protect nature. So, John, I mean, that's a lovely example. Do you have actual data from your farm that can give a sort of real sense of how much impact what you're doing is having?
Well, that's the beauty of the Cotton Trust Protocol. We've been doing these practices for some time, and as you just illustrated, there are new practices out there. That's one that I had not considered or heard of, so it's something we'll have to look into. But the Cotton Trust Protocol provides metrics that we can use to establish a baseline of where we are and what we've been doing, our water usage, energy usage, soil conservation practices, all these things that we've been doing. It provides metrics to measure those, but not only measure them within our own farm, we can look outward and see what other producers are doing and where we are relative to the ag community as a whole, and it provides input for new ideas and new approaches. So I'm excited about being part of the Cotton Trust Protocol. I think it's going to. One thing farmers are not good at doing is telling their story. We're very good at getting up early, working hard all day, marketing, putting the crop in, looking after our employees. All that takes a lot of time. We don't take a lot of time to stand up and tell our story on what we are doing to reduce our environmental footprint and as environmental stewards. And I think the Cotton Trust Protocol puts metrics to that so that we can measure it and provide that information to our customers. And just as importantly, they can then provide it to their customers.
Well, I think we're trying to help you tell your story in a way by having this conversation. But you know, some of the numbers that are from the protocol, the goal of reducing greenhouse gases by 39% over the next 5 years, it's a lot though, isn't it, John? When you say already how much you've achieved, is it actually achievable to reduce it that much more?
Well, 20 years ago, when we first started precision agriculture, we were putting together equipment to do site-specific applications. We had to manufacture it and install it in our tractors. Now, every piece of equipment that comes has precision ag built into it. You know, that's not something that we saw 20 years ago. Things have changed dramatically, and the precision ag is what is allowing us to make a lot of these advances. We use remote soil sensors that we put in the field that are solar powered that send telemetry to our computers in the office to tell us when we need to be watering our crops. All those type of improvements allow us to cut back on the if we're not watering the crops more often, we're using less fuel to power the pumps, we're using less water. All these are improvements that we've made in the last 15, 20 years. Who knows exactly what the innovations will be in the next 10 or 20 years. But I suspect we'll continue to build on our successes.
And Deepika, I mean, you gave that great example of the perennial grass before. I mean, I presume that the the protocol generally is bringing to light lots of new ideas, and it enables this exchange, and obviously the data hugely important.
Of course, I mean, that is one of the reasons, like what John said. I mean, we learned so much from growers, and this is like a best place where we see all this new experiments that the growers do. There is something that is going on here. We all need to see. And it's like a kind of way of learning. And that is what the trust protocol data is providing.
And when I mean, the same question that I asked to John about the really ambitious goals, do you feel confident, Deepika, that they can be reached?
So it's kind of like shoot for the moon and you reach in the stars. So it's always good to have a goal, and the goal is more for a continuous improvement. It's not a hard and fast number. Yes, we have a goal of 39% reduction of greenhouse gas, but it's all about having the number improve over the years. It's not just one hard line. So, yeah.
And in the end, John, it isn't just about numbers, and it certainly isn't just about money, is it? Because, I mean, if we hear that when Deepika's talking about the sort of temperatures that they've been having up there in Seattle in recent times, we're all feeling the effects of climate change. And, I mean, obviously farmers feeling it more than anybody. So you must feel really passionate about it on that level.
Well, I run a family farm. I farmed with my father, who farmed for 70 years, just passed away recently, and I look forward to farming for many more years. But we raised our families here. We work, we hunt, we fish, we're involved in the communities and the environment outside of agriculture, and so it is important to us. It's all part of community, looking after one another and promoting a strong, healthy environment.
Well, I think with that we can finish, because that's really interesting, and so interesting to hear how the protocol is helping with this exchange of thoughts and ideas, and to hear exactly what you're doing down on your farm, John. So thank you both very much indeed. Lots of thoughts there on how cotton is connecting to greenhouse emissions and what's been done to reduce those emissions. And that is it for this edition of the US Cotton Trust Protocol's Smarter Conversations. You can learn more about the Trust Protocol at trustuscotton.org. I'd like to thank our guest this week, Deepika Mishra, who is the Global Sustainability Manager for the National Cotton Council of America, and John Lindamood, cotton grower from Tennessee. Thank you to you, John, as well. So I hope that you can all join us again next time. But for now, goodbye.